recording this meeting. And so you should just see the pop-up now for the recording. This recording will be posted on our website so that you can go back and view the webinar if you have any additional questions or would like to rewatch a certain section about a particular topic. And so with that, thank you so much for joining us this morning for our kickoff webinar for our Georgia BEAD grant program. My name is Jessica Simmons. I serve as the Deputy CIO and Executive Director for the Georgia Broadband Program. And on our call today, we have our team that will be speaking throughout the presentation, and all of our contact information will be available also at the end of the presentation. That being said, if we could go ahead and ask everybody to go ahead and mute themselves just so that there's not any feedback on the call. And again, if we could go ahead and ask everybody just to go ahead and mute, I'm going to mute everyone. Perfect. And I apologize. We're still trying to get more people in through the lobby. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to go ahead and get started. As we've gone over before, Georgia was very excited to have our BEAD allocation announced in June of last year. The state is receiving just over $1.3 billion to achieve the program requirements of getting to the remaining unserved and underserved locations in the state of Georgia. As we've discussed previously, the state has received just under $5 million in planning grant funds that we're utilizing to facilitate this program and administrative functions of our office. And but with that, ultimately, we are very excited and confident about the allocation that we've received leading into the work that we're going to discuss here in just a moment. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview of the BEAD program. Obviously, as I've just mentioned, in July or June of 2023, our allocation, along with all other states and territories allocations for this program, were announced. 2023 and 2024 have been largely planning years for us, working on creating the deliverables that we've already submitted to NTIA and gotten approved, which is our BEAD 5-year action plan, which is a high-level overview of the state of connectivity in the state of Georgia. Our initial proposal, volume 1, which detailed the parameters around our state-run challenge process for BEAD to make sure that we had the best possible data leading into this grant phase. And then our initial proposal, volume 2, which has also been approved, which allows us to move into the grant round, the competitive subgrantee selection for BEAD. And so again, we are now in the phase that we actually are able to go ahead and start our provisional grant program. And that is opening as we've released on December 2nd of this year. And the application window will close on January 15th at 5 p.m. Based on that, we will also generally see, when we get our final proposal approved from NTIA, the ability for projects to move forward and to get into the permitting process, and then ultimately for construction to begin hopefully in late 2025 or 2026. If we can go to the next slide, please. As we mentioned before, with our initial proposal, volume 1, that detailed the state's challenge process and how we were going to make certain policy decisions and run a very data-based process to make sure that we had the best possible data leading into this grant related to the eligible locations being both unserved, underserved, and community anchor institutions. Based on the outcome of that process, we had a great participation from many of the people on this call and throughout the state. And so as you can see with our BEAD eligible numbers, which are available at broadband.georgia.gov, to also get the fabric IDs for those locations, and then also to see the BEAD eligible map, please just visit that website. But as you can see, there's just over 71,000 unserved locations that are eligible for the grant, and just over 93,000 underserved locations, for a total of just over 165,000 locations that will be eligible for this funding. We can go to the next slide, please. As we've, I think, talked about a lot in this process, there are a lot of really important relevant documents that provide guidance to applicants how we are going to run this program. The first is NTIA's Notice of Funding Opportunity that has been out for quite some time, and that is what has really driven how the state crafted both our initial proposal volume 1 and initial proposal volume 2. The initial proposal volume 2, which is available on our website, really details in very lengthy detail the parameters of the grant program, how the program will be scored, mandatory requirements that are detailed both in NTI's Notice of Funding Opportunity, and then also parameters about how Georgia is going to be implementing them, such as the low cost service option, and then also a lot of details that are going to be required of applicants that we will be going over at a very high level today. If we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So getting into a little bit more of the phases that we're about to see as we go into sub-grantee selection. First, obviously, we're going to be receiving applications, and is why we're doing the kickoff today, that we're very pleased on December 2nd that we will be announcing, or I'll be opening our portal. The link for the portal will be available when it is open on our website, and we'll also send that out using our listserv. So we want to make sure that if you have not signed up for our listserv, please do. That's where we're going to be sharing all of the relevant information for all the different phases of this program. So again, the application portal will be opening on December 2nd, where applicants will have the ability to input all of the information required in the application. Georgia is not doing a pre-qualification round. All of the questions related to our grant application are included in one application. So you'll see that there's gating criteria, and then there's also a number of project-specific questions as well. That being said, we will obviously be doing applications based on county project areas, and we are allowing the ability for applicants to remove a very small number of locations, hopefully, that really impact the cost of your application. Once the grant window closes on January 15th, we will be then moving into our scoring phase, where the state, along with our team of contractors, will be reviewing each of the individual sections of the application. And hopefully moving through this very quickly. One of the goals of the portal that we have built is also to try to automate scoring as much as possible, so that we can hopefully get through each of these phases rather quickly. Based on the data that we receive from round 1 grant applications, the state will also be setting an extreme high cost per location threshold. So essentially setting the dollar amount per NTI's Notice of Funding Opportunity to essentially draw the baseline of where, if a particular location exceeds a certain dollar amount, that we will be putting that to an additional round, most likely for a different, either reliable or alternative technology. Then this is a component that's a little bit new to our previous grants. Obviously, if there's awardees on the call that have received either State Fiscal Recovery Fund or Capital Projects Fund money under the American Rescue Plan Act, this is kind of a new component that we've incorporated for BEAD because of our requirement to get to 100% coverage, that there will be a negotiation phase, which is detailed in length in the state's approved Volume 2, where essentially we'll have the ability to work with applicants where in areas where either a county grant area didn't receive a proposal, or there's certain locations within that proposal that flag above that extreme high cost threshold. And so that ultimately we can determine, based on our scoring rubric, the best path forward. And I will ask if everybody could just mute themselves, please. And then based on that, following the negotiation process, which we expect to be a very short process, we will work with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, that is the eligible entity for BEAD, and provisional awards will be made. And then ultimately those sub-grantees will be added to our list, so that as we submit our final proposal to NTIA, that they're part of our 100%. And then at that point, once we get an approved final proposal from NTIA, applicants will be, or subgrantees will be signing final terms and conditions with the Office of Planning and Budget, memorializing the award and moving forward with the program. If we can we go to the next slide, please? Again, as I mentioned, we're doing countywide grant areas. It's something that we've done in the past. We think that it's going to be a successful path for BEAD. We have a lot of counties here in Georgia, and it's also something that, ultimately I think is going to help us meet our goals of making sure we get to 100% coverage with this grant. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the last thing I wanted to briefly cover is that this is the scoring rubric that we've identified in our initial proposal, volume 2, for priority projects. A priority project based on NTIA's NOFO is a 100% fiber project. We will only be accepting applications for fiber in round 1 of our grant, as it was detailed in our notice of funding or in our initial proposal volume 2, and will also be in our notice of funding opportunity that will be released today. But the scoring is as follows, where the total outlay of funds is 50 points. The affordability component is the total outlay funds is 50, the affordability is 15, and then compliance with fair labor laws is 10. That 75 points was set by NTIA. We just had the ability to move points within each of those categories. And then the following categories were set by the state of speed to deployment, community and local government support, which you can see based on the scoring rubric here is very important to us and has always been important to the grants that we have administered. The ability to include any eligible community anchor institutions in the grant will be 3 additional points, and then the universality of applications, 8 points. So essentially, what percentage of the eligible locations are you proposing to go to in that county project area? If we can go to the next slide, please. I'll briefly touch on this. This will be only applicable for future rounds where we are looking at any other type of technology other than fiber. Just to highlight, there is an amended scoring rubric where instead of universality of applications, we're looking at the speed of the network and other technical capabilities. But again, just wanted to highlight that that is something for a future round and not this one. One important thing that we also wanted to highlight that you'll be seeing a lot of documents released from our office today is that we're going to be releasing the BEAD notice of funding opportunity. We're also going to be releasing our FAQs. That will be an iterative document, but the first version of the FAQs will be coming out along with a technical assistance guide. And so we also will be detailing in those documents clarification for scoring for kind of 2 particular areas within our volume 2 that needed clarification. One is any area where there's community anchor institutions that are the only eligible locations for BEAD in a project area. And then additionally, there are some project areas that don't have any eligible community anchor institutions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jen Wade with RSM to talk in more detail about budget items and then also reporting and compliance.
Perfect. Thank you. So obviously with BEAD, as many of you know from just reading through the initial proposal, volume 2, there are a lot more requirements under BEAD than there were with many of the programs you're familiar with, including state fiscal recovery funds and CPF broadband programs. So this is obviously, we're going to highlight some of these key application areas here. It's a non-exhaustive list of those requirements, but just some things to highlight as you do prepare for your application, as this is a kickoff webinar for the application. So again, Jessica kind of alluded to the budget. In this, it'll be much greater detail than you're used to seeing on state fiscal recovery funds as well as CPF. You'll have a extremely detailed budget in addition to a budget narrative, your eligible expenses, and we'll get into what those eligible expenses will look like as well. The match fund requirement, again, differs from previous programs that you've had. The letter of credit or alternative performance bond requirement, cybersecurity and supply chain risk management, monitoring and compliance, payment structure under fixed subawards, as well as reporting requirements. Next slide, please. So again, I alluded to the detailed budget here. There are pre-award expenses that NTIA does allow, and the state will allow for in the budget as well. Those pre-award expenses should be clearly identified within your budget, as well as the budget narrative, including, descriptions of why they're justifiable under this program. Any applications that have pre-award costs in there do want to note that the applicant assumes all the responsibility of any pre-award costs in the event that they don't win an award, right? So if you have pre-award costs related to, putting the application together or administrative stuff, just note that you do assume the responsibility there. We'll go through the limited permissible activities under NEPA that NTIA does allow. And again, account for all of your applicable cost categories in the budget and make sure that you're very, very thorough. Next slide. So for eligible expenses here, eligible uses of funding in connection with the last mile broadband deployment projects under the priority that the state will conduct for the first round include construction, improvements to or acquisition of facilities. Again, I'm not going to read through all these, but long-term leases, deployment of internet services, engineering, design, permitting, personnel costs, including salaries and fringe benefits, network software upgrades, training for cybersecurity professionals under the cybersecurity requirement, workforce development, including registered apprenticeships, etc. Next slide, please. So going back to those pre-award costs. So again, under NTIA's requirements, there are limited permissible activities. And these are implementation activities, site preparation, etc. However, those types of activities are not considered pre-award. Those cannot begin prior to completion of all the environmental historic preservation requirements under NEPA, as outlined in this section. Based on the guidelines that NTIA does have, the state will allow those limited permissible activities under NEPA, so you can include these in your budget. Those include, the pre-construction planning, applications for environmental permits, studies, including but not limited to environmental assessments, wetland delineations, biological assessments, etc., administrative costs, pre-award application costs, activity supporting consultations required under NHPA, etc., limited preliminary procurement, including the purchase or lease of equipment, or entering into binding contracts to do so, the purchase of applicable or conditional insurance, and or funds used to secure land or building leases, including right-of-way easements. Again, just wanted to highlight subrecipients that undertake unauthorized project activities in contravention of this information proceed at their own risk, particularly if you do have pre-award costs and you are not, you don't end up receiving the award. Again, as you do put together your budget, make sure that all of this aligns with those limited permissible activities. Make sure that your activities under any of the deployment section as well, that you outline in your narrative how it relates to this grant, and be very, very thorough in your description. Next slide, please. So again, there's a match requirement here, and we're getting a lot of questions about eligible sources of match. So again, under NTIA's rules and regulations, funds from other federal funds are generally not used for matching funds. They do allow that matching funds for BEAD can come from the following: the Families First, you have the Coronavirus Act, then CARES as well, consolidated appropriations, ARPA grant funds, and then loan funding issued through a federal agency such as the USDA Reconnect program can also be used as match funding. Next slide. In addition to the match, there is in-kind match that is available to be used under this. An in-kind match here is really non-cash donations, so property, goods, services, etc., that benefit the project. This could count towards satisfying your non-federal match requirement here. GTA is required under the NTIA guidelines to maintain thorough documentation to justify the valuation of any in-kind match that subrecipients include in their budget. And so again, highlighting here, being very thorough when you do put this into your application, you're going to be asked in the application to document your in-kind match, the valuation of that. So you must clearly show how the assigned value was determined. Your record should include details on the contribution, the valuation method used, and the donation terms to support the amount claimed as matching funds for the project. Additionally, the contribution should be both relevant and necessary for the project. And again, going back to your budget narrative, if you do include in-kind match, be sure to include the in-kind match in your budget narrative and the relevancy for the project in the in-kind match. Next slide, please. Letter of credit performance bonds. During the application period, obviously the state is not going to ask for the letter of credit during the application process. During this process, though, you will be required to certify that the organization is aware of and understands the requirement for the letter of credit or performance bond obligation as outlined in the BEAD NOFO and the volume 2 for the state. In addition, you will be required to advise if you're going to be utilizing the letter of credit or performance bond, and then you'll have subsequent questions along the application related to those. Next slide, please. GTA, as Jessica mentioned, will make preliminary awards, which are subject to NTIA's final review and approval. Prior to entering into the agreement, prospective subrecipients, again, you'll be required to certify that you meet and understand the requirement. But in between, when you have the preliminary award, in between that phase and the execution of the final terms and conditions agreement, if you are utilizing a letter of credit, subrecipients must provide an irrevocable standby letter of credit in the required form, acceptable in all respects to the state, and a value of no less than 25% of the subaward. If utilizing a performance bond, subrecipients shall obtain a letter from the company holding a certification of authority as an acceptable surety on federal bonds as identified in the Department of Treasury Circular 570, committing to issue a performance bond to the prospective subrecipient. So again, on application, you certify that you understand the requirement and that you're able to meet that. And then in between establishing the preliminary award and executing the final terms and conditions agreement, you'll be asked to actually present those. Next slide, please. Another requirement under the BEAD program is a cybersecurity and supply chain risk management plan. The state will provide, as Jessica mentioned, some templates to utilize on their website regarding the cybersecurity risk management plan. That does revolve around the NIST framework. So please make sure you will be asked in the application that you understand and can provide, if you are already operating as a provider, that you have a cybersecurity plan in place. And I just do want to highlight too, and I'll touch on this briefly at the end on compliance and monitoring. We will ask you for those cybersecurity plans, and we will make sure that they do adhere to the NIST framework. So even though you're asked that in the application that you do certify that you'll meet that, we will ask for that and under the monitoring plan. Next slide, please. So again, under monitoring and compliance, the requirement under BEAD is that NTIA will conduct ongoing monitoring for the state to ensure that they are monitoring their subrecipients. And so to set expectations, as a subrecipient, you will be expected to comply with all of the regulations, federal laws, uniform guidance, et cetera, that apply to the BEAD program. Subrecipients can expect thorough and structured monitoring processes. Those of you that have state fiscal recovery funds or CPF funds, understand that we are in the field doing speed tests, asking for documents, et cetera. All of this includes, again, financial, programmatic performance, site visits, desk reviews, self-assessments. Subrecipients should be prepared to provide comprehensive and accurate documentation, including, again, those financial records, the audits, detailed expenditure reports, and proof of compliance. We'll talk briefly on, fixed subaward structure and what that entails. And some of that does alleviate some of the requirements under uniform guidance. However, when conducting the monitoring and compliance aspect of the BEAD program, you will be asked for, further details in the field. Again, the expenditure reports, proof of compliance with program guidelines, including Davis-Bacon, et cetera. Again, you may need to share policies and procedures to make sure you do align with the uniform guidance that is applicable under the program, demonstration of your internal controls, participation in discussions with monitoring staff and third-party auditors to clarify any practices and address any potential compliance issues. Next slide, please. I do want to highlight, actually, if you go back one, Maria, thank you. Highlight one more thing under the compliance and monitoring. So this is just a brief overview of what is expected. Your cooperation with monitoring, audits, records requirements, assessments, and evaluations, all of this will be in your terms and conditions agreement that you do execute with the state. So I wanted to highlight this just so it doesn't take you by surprise, but all records and expenditures are subject to any compliance and monitoring. So again, just because the fixed subaward structure does allow for some of those uniform guidance regulations to be not applicable in the field, any of the procurement documentation, expenditure reports, any of that stuff, may be asked. So just ensure that you're actually documenting and detailing everything and maintaining your records. Next slide, please. So again, the state will utilize a fixed subaward structure. This will be similar to state fiscal recovery funds and CPF that you are used to with the uniform guidance flexibilities that Treasury afforded under that program in May of 2023. NTIA has harmonized with Treasury's guidance on this. And so the fixed subaward structure will be a performance-based method similar to those programs. However, NTIA does require that these be reimbursement-based. And so they will be reimbursement-based on milestones. So there'll be completion of grant milestones as outlined in Georgia's initial proposal, volume 2. As well as the subrecipient will also provide documentation that they're compliant with getting these, BSLs online. So you will be asked for certification and a submittal of as-built and GIS location data as well. Next slide, please. So for the reporting aspect, you'll have semi-annual reporting. The state can ask for, more detailed reporting as well, so it may be more frequent. However, NTIA does require semi-annual reporting from the state. Included in this are those listed below: speed, price, and fees, interconnection agreements, contracts and subcontracts, if you're minority-owned business, women-owned business, etc. Data and mapping collection standards, SF 425 from the state to meet those terms as well. And you'll note here labor reporting for projects with $5 million or more. So again, Davis-Bacon or that alternative. And then highlighted on the right, again, additional BEAD compliance requirements that may differ from state fiscal recovery funds and CPF if you have those awards. BABA, so Build America, Buy America, that previously has been a preference in former programs. This is a requirement. The National Environmental Policy Act, so NEPA, is a requirement under BEAD, as well as the National Historic Preservation Act. So NEPA and historic preservation are required under this. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over now to CTC to discuss the technical requirements that you'll be required to demonstrate during your application.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. So as with most federal projects, there is a technical component as well. So BEAD is no different there. In fact, in the NOFO, they specifically call out a need for design, a network diagram, project cost, and project timeline, all certified by a professional engineer, and then to be reviewed by the State Broadband Office. So how that translates to the application is the following. We'll be asking for some specific submissions on the technical side. So that includes a technical narrative, network designs, logical network design drawing, project cost, project timeline with milestones specifically, that professional engineering certification that I mentioned earlier, capital investment schedule, and then we're also looking for some environmental and climate factor information in your design as well. Just a quick note on the professional engineering certification. NTIA released a limited conditional waiver regarding that. So you no longer have to have a professional engineer from the state that you're in conducting the project certify your design. So it doesn't need to be someone from Georgia with a professional engineering license. It could be any one of the 56 eligible entities. And additionally, they do not need to certify the capital investment schedule since it's outside of their purview anyway. Next slide. So I'll be going to each of these items. in a little bit more detail, although I'll go through these relatively quickly to leave enough time for questions and answers. So what we see the technical narrative looking like is essentially a description of how your project will provide the service and reliability that meets the BEAD requirements for all the locations that you're committed to serving. This is sort of a gap in between the other technical items you'll be submitting. So we asked for certain things that are not prevalent in those designs. So a description of how your network will be connected to sufficient backhaul infrastructure to meet the performance requirements. We'll be looking at responses that include what your projected subscriber take rate was going to be, as well as any oversubscription on the network, as well as looking at how your deployment will use industry best practices. This is also a good opportunity for if there's any additional information on the technical side that you want to convey about your design. This is a good place to put that as well if it's not covered in the other documents. Next slide. Network design submitted as shapefiles. These are going to be your routes, the locations you've committed to serve. If you're doing something that isn't fiber or priority, if there's a fixed wireless component, you'd have your propagation in there as well. But basically, this should convey your design at like a routing level so we can understand that your design is covering all of the required BSL and community anchor institutions that you committed to. Next slide. Logical network diagram is kind of the opposite. This is more of a illustration, if you will, of the logical connectivity of your network, reaching back from the internet point of present all the way to maybe how the redundancy connects to your central office or your network core, down to the FDC, and ultimately how you provide service to the end user, whether that's some type of XGS PON or something along those lines, giving us enough details to understand how your network operates. Some clear information that would be useful for these diagrams is the types of equipment that you're going to use on every layer, the amount of capacity in the backhaul, the type of redundancy that is built into the network, all useful to provide on the logical diagram. The state will be providing a sample of this so you can get an idea of what we're looking for in this response. Next slide. Project cost submitted as a spreadsheet. The project costs are essential to know what your assumptions are for how your project deployment is going to be, and it equates to what your ask for grant funds is going to be as well. We're providing a template for this that should ideally make this simple or at least uniform for the submission responses. What we need to see in the project cost is sufficient granularity that demonstrates your understanding of the costs that you're going to incur on this project. We'd also like to have enough detailed itemization so we can understand that the costs that you're proposing are eligible by the BEAD grant funds. So we'll provide a spreadsheet and an exact example of how it can be filled out to give you some ideas. While we do have a uniform spreadsheet to fill in, we're leaving it open to the applicants to put the layer of granularity that they're looking to insert into the document. Next slide, please. A little additional details, and I'll let folks read this because a copy of this deck will be available to them. But for every item that you're putting in, we're looking for a description of the cost, and then sort of a calculation of what those costs are. So a cost category is something to help you roll up your categories or your costs into specific categories, whether that's engineering, permitting, construction, subscriber activation, those types of things as well. So that's just something that you'll do from a pull down box. We're looking at the unit type. So this is the measurement. It could be feet, hours, each, etc. So that's how you calculate your cost. So it could be X thousand feet of conduit, X number of handholds, X hours of engineering support, right? Unit quantity is that quantity that we're looking for. The unit cost is the obvious cost per item that auto calculates up to the cost that you're looking for. Again, we're pretty descriptive in what we want to see in each of these columns, but we're giving the applicant the flexibility to detail how they want to input this information or what kind of level of granularity beyond that they want to provide. We understand that different organizations of different sizes have different ways of calculating their project costs, so we want to be flexible to that, but also get the data in a uniform way. Next slide. Project timeline, a similar way, will provide a template for applicants to fill out, trying to make it uniform in the responses that we're seeing. This milestone will have a couple key this timeline of a couple key milestones that we're looking for, including the planning and engineering, permitting, make ready, material, equipment, and procurement, network construction, your subscriber activation schedule, and project closeout submission. That project closeout submission is sort of your indication of when your project will be complete. You'll have asked for all of your reimbursement and you'll submitted all of your appropriate materials for closeout. We understand that subscriber activations is something that continues on well after after your project is done. That's why we want to have a clear indication of the project end date, which is that project closeout submission milestone. Next slide, please. And then mentioned the professional engineering certification earlier. Does not need to be from the state of Georgia. They just need to be a currently licensed professional engineer. As part of the template we'll provide you, it will give them the ability to attest to your project will meet the BEAD requirements and be able to be completed within the 4-year deployment timeframe. We're looking for the name, the license number, the state that they're licensed in, and then just want to make sure that they're currently licensed as well. So the expiration date as well as their signature. Again, this is a limited waiver. It only certifies the items that we've called out. Not the capital investment schedule is no longer included in that. And then next slide. And then lastly, we want to talk on some environmental and climate factors. So as you know, an important part of having workable infrastructure in Georgia is having proper stormproofing. So we would like you to give us a description of how your network design will be resilient against regional weather events. We like to know your technical viability in terms of the types of fiber you'll be using and how you'll have additional capacity for future growth and sustainability on your network. And then how you'll be complying with local standards, both in permitting of right-of-way as well as local environmental regulations and awareness of vulnerable areas. Next slide, please. And then mentioned the professional engineering certification earlier, which is a professional engineer certifying that your design is going to be compliant with the BEAD requirements and completed in the time. We're also asking for some additional certifications from the applicant themselves or their authorized organizational representative. These are very specific things just to ensure that you understand what the BEAD requirements are and that your company is committed to meet those as well. And those will be spelled out clearly in the application. Next slide. That's it for me.
Well, great. Well, thank you. We have been trying to keep up with questions in the chat as we've been going. I think we've got a couple of questions that we have not been able to answer. And so we can go ahead and jump into those, and then we can also open it up for any additional questions. Just a couple of items. We will be posting these slides online. The project areas, as I previously mentioned, are based on county boundaries, and the eligible locations are on the website at broadband.georgia.gov. The application dates, it will be opening on December 2nd and will be closing on January 15th at 5 p.m. Jumping in quickly, we'll also have this detailed further in the FAQs that we will be releasing, but there will be a mechanism where locations can be flagged for the state that if with proof and evidence that ultimately the state is willing to accept to show if a location in very limited circumstances is already served, or that we're already hearing obviously from potential issues in the fabric of a location that's currently coded as a BSL but shouldn't be considered a BSL. And so additional guidance will be coming out in our FAQs of how the state will be able to work with providers and applicants to mitigate those locations. And additionally, on broadband.georgia.gov, that is where we have our list of validated, unserved, underserved, and served locations, along with community anchor institutions. So all of that data has been available for a number of weeks now on our website, along with the draft application questions. It looks like the next question we've got, and I think I'm going to turn this one over to RSM, but it says, can an applicant change from originally proposed securities, for example, indicating a letter of credit in an application, but use a performance bond with an award offer or vice versa? I will turn that over to RSM. However, the one thing I will say is in the application, the organization essentially is certifying that they have the ability to secure that document. And so we just want to make sure that, whether that would be a significant scope change, but we do need to make sure that what is being presented in the application is obviously true and correct information moving forward for the grant. But Jen or David, if y'all want to jump in on that one.
Sure. Regarding the letter of credit in the application, Jessica, which are we in the, I'm looking for the chat question, sorry.
Yeah, it's if they indicate that a letter of credit in the application is going to be used and then they want to switch to a performance bond later.
Yeah, I think that, I don't think it's necessarily a scope change. I think that's something that we'll have to discuss, upon award. If they intend to use that in the application and change, I think as long as they meet the requirement under that, so this that letter of credit and the alternative being the performance bond, I think that's totally fine. And, upon execution of the final terms and conditions, that's something that you can negotiate with them.
Perfect. Let me see what else. I think we've tried to answer most everything on a rolling basis here. Again, talking about eligibility to apply, there is very broad eligibility based on NTI's notice of funding opportunity that will be specified in our notice of funding opportunity, but local governments, nonprofits, for-profits, cooperatives, public utilities, private utilities, it's a very comprehensive list of who essentially could be considered a potential provider based on NTI's information. And so it is a very comprehensive list of entities that are eligible to apply for the grant. But again, that'll be specified in our terms or in our FAQs today as well. Let's see. I think we're starting to get more questions now.
Yeah, there was one question.
Sorry,
there was one question about the documentation for contractors and consultants. I did just want to point out there is some uniform guidance about, the trickle down and what subrecipients should include some verbiage in their contracts. So applicants should be familiar with that. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well.
Jen, do you want to take the one about the environmental categorical exclusion?
Yep, sorry, I'm trying to find it here.
While she's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and take the next one below it. So if an applicant would like to apply for multiple counties, the way that the portal is set up is that you're essentially going to apply as an organization, and that's where you're going to include all of the gating criteria that is not project specific. It's all related to your particular entity. But you will complete a separate application per project area, which is a county boundary. But so again, if you're looking to apply for a lot of different county grant areas, which would be great, you only will have to put in the information about your organization once, and it will only be the project specific information that you would need to individually complete. The next one below it is, will an application guide or portal user guide be published to the website? Yes, we're actually posting a technical assistance manual today. And again, obviously FAQs will continue to be updated throughout the process, as well as any other documents if there are relevant updates, and we'll obviously message that through our listserv.
And I do see the categorical exclusion question now. I would say there are 35-ish, 36, I think, categorical exclusions now for BEAD. So I would highly encourage all potential applicants to go and review the BEAD categorical exclusions that they published under NTIA's website. We can also link those to Jessica. I'm not sure if they're already up, but we can also link those as well.
I see the next question is, if a company submits an application for an area and GTA indicates that they will award, can the company decline the award without penalty? Yes, the awards can be declined prior to provisional terms and conditions being signed. However, we would strongly ask that please only apply for county project areas that you would move forward with the award if you are selected. However, there is not a penalty prior to provisional terms and conditions being selected. However, if preliminary terms and conditions are signed and you are included with our final list of subgrantees with our final proposal, obviously that creates a lot of issues for the state if we have to go back and amend that with NTIA if a company would back out. But we would, again, only strongly encourage applicants to apply for areas where they would be willing to accept the award. The next question is, will applicants be required to show local government support? While it is not a requirement, it is a scored category that if you look in our secondary scoring based on the rubrics I showed earlier, that is actually the area where the states were only allowed to allocate points in the secondary portion of that. And that's where we put the most number of points that we had available to allocate. So having local government support, and that can be from, elected officials, that can be letters from community anchor institutions, from the county. We detail all of that in volume 2, but having local government support is very important for the application. We believe that it's critical for local governments and members of the community to be aware of the application. Obviously, there's going to be a permitting component at the local level for these projects, and while it is not a requirement, it is something that if local government support is not shown, then that is a significant area where points would be lacking in an application. Let's see here. If multiple companies apply to serve within one county, is the process limited to a certain number of companies or open to all based on the application? So there is no limit. As many companies as would like can certainly apply for the same project area. This is a competitive process where we are selecting subgrantees for these funds. And so we certainly encourage competition. And so there is no limit for the number of companies that are eligible to apply for a particular project area. And then the second question is, are there any requirements for county governments in the application if the applicant is a private company? I'm not sure I understand that question. There are different requirements based on our initial proposal, volume 2. If an entity that's applying is currently a broadband provider or if they're a new entrant. New entrants are eligible to apply, and we've got additional information about new entrants in our FAQs along with volume 2. There's some additional documentation that we require to look at in the application if a company has not previously provided broadband services before. But there is a great deal of flexibility of who is eligible to apply, and even based on if a company is currently providing broadband service or if they are a new entrant. Again, it's really just around a documentation requirement at that point. Do applicants receive a higher score in the minimal BEAD outlay section for offering a match percentage above the minimum? In our previous grants, we have scored matching funds. Matching funds are not scored for this grant. However, while matching funds are not directly scored, ultimately the better match that you put into the program, the lower amount of BEAD dollars that you're going to be asking for, which will make you more competitive in that particular criteria. And so again, while it's not a scored component, the overall amount of BEAD money that you're asking for is. And so ultimately, however large of a match percentage you put in over the minimum would obviously I guess indirectly impact your scoring for that, because ultimately you're scored based on the total amount of BEAD funds you're requesting for the project. I think we might have covered this one already, the types of supporting documentation for independent contractors and consultants. Jen, I think that you already covered that one, correct?
Correct.
It looks like the next one is, are performance bond expenses reimbursable? Jen, do you
Yeah,
want to take that one?
Yeah, and David, I'm happy for you to jump in here as well, but currently as it's listed
Yes.
under, go ahead.
Yes, my apologies. It's my understanding that payment and performance bonds are cost of the project that would be reimbursed.
Right? Is there an award date set? No. Based on this process, we have to score the applications. Obviously, how long it takes to get through scoring depends on the volume received. Then following scoring, then we move into our negotiation phase. And then we will be releasing more information about this, but the state for BEAD is not able to make public announcements of preliminary awards the way that we have been for previous programs. Ultimately, we are restricted from NTIA of essentially how the announcements are made. And so we don't have a specific date set. However, we are trying to move through this process quickly because we do foresee that we're going to have to open additional rounds for potential different types of technology other than fiber. But we will keep everybody updated via our listserv as we kind of go through different phases in this process, that we'll definitely make sure that everybody is aware of kind of what phase the state is on through the listserv group and then also our website. There is not a waiver process. So the question is, will waivers be accepted if we don't want to cover the entire county? There is not a waiver. You would just apply for, essentially the way it works is there's a spreadsheet that you upload where you include all of the fabric IDs for the locations you're applying for and all the fabric IDs you're proposing to remove out of a project area. However, I will say, based on the universality of applications scoring criteria, you do receive more points based on keeping the most number of eligible locations within your proposal. Also, if it looks like you are severely removing locations where it could be considered cherry picking, or if it's a drastic reduction in the number of locations, based on our volume 2, the state does reserve the right to disqualify an application. So there is not a waiver process. You essentially put in the application what you're applying for and what you're proposing to remove. And then at that point, again, based on the proposals and how that compares to the other applications received in the county, again, it is a scored component, so it's certainly highly encouraged to keep as many locations in as possible. So the question is, can you talk a little bit more about the role of community anchor institutions? How should we advise libraries and work with their counties? As we mentioned, units of local government are eligible to apply for the grant. And so we would certainly advise for any of the community anchor institutions to either talk to providers that you believe are going to apply for your particular area, or work with your local government, since they are an eligible entity to apply for BEAD. Says, does the application require that we provide current speed tiers and pricing as well as what we will provide in a BEAD funded county? Yes, we will need to know current pricing and then the commitment that you are proposing for the funded area. If a county is designated as a high-cost area and has multiple applicants, will the application process be reopened to the public, or will it be limited to those that applied for the county in round 1? So based on how we're planning to handle the extreme high cost threshold, if there are multiple applications for a particular project area, but locations within those applications exceed the extreme high cost threshold, first we're going to use the negotiation phase in round 1 to see if we are able to come to an agreement, if ultimately we need to move locations to a later round. Or it is also possible that based on the outcome of round 1, that perhaps the entire project area could be moved to round 2. So ultimately, it depends on the applications that are received and then the dollar amounts for those locations. And if it does exceed extreme high cost threshold for a significant number of the locations, we will be using the negotiation phase. But it is possible that at that point, potentially an entire project area could move to a later round for other types of technology. Jen, I'm going to send this one over to you. Can BEAD eligible costs incurred prior to the executed award agreement be included in the award? Example, design and construction that begins this year and will contribute to the application.
So if you recall, kind of halfway through, we did talk through the limited permissible activities that you can conduct pre-award. However, construction cannot be a part of that pre-award cost, given the fact that NTIA requires the approval under NEPA first. So I would go back to that slide and make sure that anything that you're requesting in the budget does align to those permissible activities for pre-award.
Yeah, and that's a great point just to highlight again of no construction on these projects can begin before you have completed the permitting process through NTIA. And it's also something that we can continue to put out more guidance on. But it is really critical to make sure that you review all these documents to make sure you're aware of what's an eligible expense and what is not. We have just a couple more questions here and a couple more minutes. We're going to try to get through all of them. Can a county write more than one letter of support for multiple companies? Yes, absolutely. We would greatly encourage local governments to write as many letters of support for any and all companies that you feel comfortable supporting their application. There is no limit to say, I gave a letter of support to this company, so I can't give one to this company. We would strongly encourage you to support whoever you're comfortable with, and you're allowed to give out as many letters of support as you would like for this process. Can GTA confirm the number of locations in a county? How would we do that? So all of the data is located on our website at broadband.georgia.gov. Certainly happy to talk offline if there's any questions, but all of that data has been available online for a number of weeks. Is there a way to make a submission contingent upon another? Would only make sense for a company if they were awarded the adjacent. There's a final section in the application that essentially is an open text box that allows you to share any information with the state that you do not feel has previously been reflected in any of the other application questions. Really more so helpful information or anything else you'd like the state to be aware of as we lead into the negotiation phase. However, there is nothing in the application that can make one project area contingent upon the award of another. Let's see, we just got a couple more questions. Will GTA or OPB release a draft subaward agreement? Yes, the state is currently finalizing that, and as soon as it is a draft is available, we are happy to share that. Is there a timeline mentioned? We will also provide a timeline on our website as we're uploading all of the documents today. Does the state wish to see all eligible CIIs included in the round one applications or just unserved and underserved non-CII locations? Are eligible CIIs to be covered in a later application round after all unserved or underserved non-CII locations are first contained in a award application? So ideally, to get the 3 points for the community anchor institutions section in our scoring criteria would be to add all of the unserved and underserved CII locations within your application for that project area. That's the way you get maximum points for that scoring criteria. However, again, you're not required to add those, but that is obviously a scoring criteria to get to the full 100 points for the application. Obviously, we will continue to work through our grant rounds to make sure that we ultimately find funding commitments for all of the eligible locations. But ideally, we would like to see them all contained in the proposal for the project area. Really quickly, I know we're running out of time. The extreme high cost threshold, as I mentioned before, is going to be set once we receive application data from round one. And what we will do is we will try to go ahead now that we are at time, look if there's any additional questions that have been asked, and we can see if we can add those to our FAQs that will be going out today. Please watch our listserv. We will be sending a lot of documentation later this afternoon, along with a lot of the information that we have shared here today, along with links. As always, please feel free to reach out to us and our team. The best way to reach out to us is using our our email, which is broadband.gta or at gta.ga.gov. Our entire team checks this box, and it's the easiest and quickest way to communicate with our office. Thank you so much for joining us for the webinar today. And again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at this email address. And you should see a lot of additional information coming from our office later today. Thank you very much for your time.